Hello, my name is Nulli, and with me are my co hosts, all the way from the frozen tundra that is Canada. We have Obaid.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining.
Okay. And from the wasteland that loves to kill every single person that lives here, we have my fellow Australian, Dean, aka the Red Murtad.
Hey guys.
And welcome to the Heretics Corner.
Hey, well, everyone, welcome. This is our first episode, and we just wanted to tell you a little bit about ourselves. The podcast is called Heretics Corner, and what we want to do with Heretics Corner is a podcast that focuses on issues that apostates face. We will be talking with guests about the issues that they have faced and how they've overcome them, and any advice they might have. We will also be having on professionals who deal with these issues and offer counseling to apostates. We hope that by discussing what we have faced and what others have faced, we will be able to help apostates live better and more productive lives. And we thought the best way to start this would be to tell you a little bit about ourselves. So I'm going to hand it over to my co-host Dean, so he can tell you a bit about his story.
Thanks. Hey guys, so my name is Dean, aka the Red Murtad. This is sort of the first time I'm doing anything like this, but I've been in the ex-Muslim community for about 2 years now. My background is technically Sri Lankan, but I've never really lived there. So in reality, I grew up in Saudi Arabia for about the first 10 years of my life. And if I were to begin my story, I'd have to start off there, obviously, because, while growing up in the Islamic heartland, I sort of had my first taste of Islamic hate preaching. We go to the mosque pretty much 5 times a day, as much as we possibly could, because we live right next door. And the imams there were always like just spouting the most hateful things. Up until this point in my life, I've ever heard anyone say in person. Things like just hatred for the kuffar, hatred for like homosexuals, non-Muslims in general, but also the West. And so that was my upbringing, and having that in contrast with sort of the Western values that I saw on TV and that I read about in books, because I read a lot of literature, and pretty much all the good stuff was obviously written by non-Muslims. I was pretty opinionated right from the start about the conflict between Islam and the West. And honestly, I'd say that I kind of already had these Western liberal values at the time, even though I was just a kid and I probably couldn't put a name on it. And basically, that led to a lot of conflict very early on with my family. By about 7 years old, I remember being in open, heated arguments with my father. And it was usually something minor would trigger it, like he would just command me to do something, and or he'd get violent. I remember one time he asked me to pray, and he would complain that he never saw me praying, so he'd get out his belt and start whacking me for not being visibly praying. So obviously, as a child, like what I did was I started praying in his room, and and what he would do, I remember one particular occasion where he saw me praying in his room, and while I was praying, he got out his belt and just started muttering to himself. And after I finished, he said, "You're just doing this for my sake. You're not doing it for Allah." And he beat me for that. So I remember being in this environment where like nothing you could do would really please my father, because he was a bit of a nutcase. But anyway, there was also this dynamic of the Islamic principle that you cannot disobey your parents, and my father would hold it against me. And it was this sort of psychotic upbringing that I had, which sort of instigated my like doubts in Islam. It wasn't even that I doubted Islam at the time. It was that I had these red flags that the mainstream version of Islam had problems with it. So by the time I was 10, I came to Australia. Fast forward a bit up until because a lot of the story from the time I was 10 till about 22 is pretty typical of a Muslim growing up in Australia. So I'll just skip ahead to that part. But yeah, so sorry, I'm a bit rusty because there's so much I've written down and I'm trying to skip ahead. Yeah, so around 22 years old, I'd been massively involved in Muslim organizations, to the point where I was hosting frequent meetings at my house for multiple Islamic organizations here, including pretty well known ones. I don't want to name them, but and for particular reasons, because my parents were extremely religious. We lived pretty close to the mosque, and I was highly involved there. I remember I'd sort of had my ups and downs in faith. Um, and guys, if you have any questions, just feel free to ask. Because
I was
know,
just actually I was just trying to ask you, what
Yeah.
years were you in Saudi? Like when were you there?
93 to 2003, probably that time frame. I'm
I
not
know because I was
entirely sure.
because I was just trying to, like, when you were
Probably.
talking about the khutbahs and everything, I was just trying to wonder what time frame was that starting at?
Yeah, yeah, it was. I mean, that was just the basic. Like every day was like that. I don't remember anything triggering it. It wasn't like after 9/11, the khutbahs got worse. Some things changed, but to be honest, it had always been like that from my memory, anyway. But yeah. Uh, so while I was growing up, I always had this fluctuating level of faith, because there were constantly red flags, constantly these things that would hit me. And I'll go to a lecture, for example, with an organization that I was highly involved with, and they would be talking about something like slavery and justifying slavery. I remember going to one lecture, and the imam was giving us this talk about scholarly opinions, and he went into how historically some respected scholars actually believe that women don't have souls, and they actually got into actual discussions about whether or not women had souls, like as in whether they were equal in like humanity to men. um and we were just casually talking about this stuff as though it wasn't despicable. Sex slavery, um pedophilia, Muhammad's marriage to Aisha, all these things. Over time, just slowly, you started to have to reason with them and take them on as part of your identity, like defending them. Because growing up in Australia from the time I was 10, I had plenty of arguments with non-Muslims. In fact, ironically, an atheist friend of mine actually converted to Islam after years and years of having arguments with him. I kind of
I mean,
regret that now.
would you consider something like that like early training for like all the mental gymnastics you have to do to make the stuff fit in modern times? Like them
Yeah,
giving you
yeah,
all these excuses,
definitely.
like it's teaching you the mental gymnastics, teaching you the apologist answers.
Yeah, I mean that was the whole point. So it was all about exposure to these bad ideas before you got exposure to them on your own, right? So if you got exposure to them on your own, you wouldn't know that um, this was already widely accepted in the Muslim community. And like for example, the sex slavery thing. You know, it's just they'll excuse it away as some kind of merciful act. Um, Whereas if you found out on your own, I know people who found it out on their own, and they just deny that it's a part of Islam, or they just distance themselves from it at all. Like they don't take the Sunnah, the Hadith, seriously at all, as a result of certain Hadith that they've discovered that were disgusting to them. So, yeah, I think it's an active effort by Muslim leaders to brainwash people, especially the youth, Muslim youth, into accepting unacceptable things. Um, and yeah, on that note, like I remember I was on a kids camp once, like a youth camp that I was teaching at, and there was one particular kid who had like a mental disability and was a bit of a loner due to like antisocial behavior. And the boy's father was actually giving a speech about how Allah punishes people in hell and on earth, such as Abu Lahab, who was given a horrible disease because he went against Islam. And the boy, who was mentally disabled, asked, like, is Allah punishing me by making me like this? And I remember the whole room went silent. And the boy's father sort of smiled and told him, Allah doesn't punish good people. He tests good people. And he was, and the kid smiled back and nodded his head. But during the break after that, because I'd been spending time with this kid, and I noticed that his demeanor had changed completely. He was picking up rocks and throwing it at the building, and I wanted to ask him, like, how he'd been affected by it. I just wanted to inquire, like, anything about, like, did he really believe what his father had said? But obviously, in that kind of situation, you can't really ask that kind of question, and yet the answer would have been obvious anyway, because he'd asked the question, right? He'd asked, did Allah make me like this because he's punishing me? And obviously the kid had to some level blamed his suffering on the will of God, and frankly, so did I. At the time, I was Muslim, but I couldn't escape that thought, that all the suffering, all of it, every death, every war, every second of pain, every disabled and dying child is the will of God. And even the things that God claims to hate would logically have to be the will of God. It's completely irrational when you think about it. It could drive a person insane to think about it too much, and especially if you can't escape a reality like being mentally disabled or having some kind of terrible luck in the world. It's just unfair for Muslims to claim that this is some kind of fair test and everyone is not tested beyond their limits, when you can just go to a graveyard or a hospital and see people tested far beyond their limits.
Yeah, and it's no, sorry,
that
I
was
didn't mean
one.
to interrupt.
Yeah, no, it's fine. If you have something to say, that's fine. Sorry,
No,
I'm
it's just
ranting.
it was like the thing we were talking about, like, okay, it's either a test or it's a punishment, but it's it's the same thing. Like, it's, well, if it happens to us, we're good people, so it's a test, and if it happened to them, they're bad people. It's just a way to
Yeah, it's
make
a contextualizing, and
yeah,
yeah,
it's a way to come to grips with it, I guess. I don't know. It's
yeah, and ultimately, it's one of these other aspects of Islam that's constantly reminding you that the world is tribalistic. That Islam wants you to think in a tribalistic us versus them kind of mentality. Um, but beyond that, I think that was a moment that really fractured my belief. I couldn't really get over this bad feeling. This red flag was just always hanging over me for months after that. And then I remember one point, I just basically, I was having a debate with some friends about ISIS. There was a Christian, there was some liberal Muslims, there was some like barely knowledgeable Muslims, and we were talking. Well, it was more like 5 people, so it wasn't that many people, but we were arguing about ISIS and the slavery that they had, and they were basically saying, all of the Muslims were saying there's no basis in Islam for sex slavery, and I was like, well. And I was like the most knowledgeable person there, and I was like, well, I've been to plenty of lectures where, and I was basically defending sex slavery, and then they moved away from that topic because it was a bit controversial, and they started talking about like girlfriends and stuff like that, because they were all like liberal Muslims, they had been dating, and I was like the most conservative Muslim there, and I'd never even considered dating as an option in my life, and I was like, but it's haram for like all these reasons, and then like suddenly midway through my sentence, I remember realizing like, in the same hour, I've been defending sex slavery and opposing like wholesome relationships with a girlfriend. Like the hypocrisy was like I couldn't live with it. And I remember going home and just thinking, I need to draw a line in the sand. I need to say, maybe this religion isn't true. And I think the only reason I was able to do that is because I had finished my undergrad degree and I had a lot of time on my hands, and I had a kind of independence that I didn't have before as well. But yeah, essentially, I asked the sheikh about the whole sex slavery thing. I went online and I looked up, statistics on things like uh, the death penalty for apostasy and things like that. And I just pretty much in a day, within a day of having that discussion with my friends, I had drawn the line in the sand personally and said, I cannot believe in Allah anymore. I remember doing like one last salah, one last prayer, Isha prayer, and at the end of it, just praying to God, like, if I can't do this anymore. Like, I've been praying to you, asking for guidance my whole life, and it just seems like you don't even exist. And just praying for him. If this is a wrong decision, I'm sincerely praying to you to guide me on the right path. And the next morning, I just woke up happier than I'd ever been. Like, I'd been on the edge of like always anxious, always like on the verge of like suicide practically at that point. Because I didn't mention this, but there was plenty of bad things going on in my life that had been building up. And ironically, leaving Islam sort of made me able to see that I didn't need to fixate on past mistakes and fixate on everything that was wrong with the world, and that in reality, it was actually quite a decent human being. But for some reason, being in the Islamic frame of mind had made me like clinically depressed. But yeah, sorry to wrap it up weirdly, but yeah,
No,
that's sort
it's
of my
fine.
story. I've never really like properly told it to anyone. But yeah, just to wrap it up in a way, I guess right now I'm doing quite a bit of volunteer work in the Muslim community, or like because I'm in the closet currently, and I do feel kind of trapped because my family is still highly conservative, and my family knows that I'm ex-Muslim, but the wider community doesn't. So it's this awkward situation where I'm trying to balance things and keep other things a secret. And even later on tonight, I think I'm going to go to a meeting for a Muslim organization to talk about a possible Islamic podcast. So,
Yeah, well, you know, you could be the snake in the Garden of Eden.
well, it's ironic, but yeah, I'm trying to liberalize the Muslim community from within.
Yeah.
So, when you like told your family that you were like, nah, I'm done with Islam, I'm ex-Muslim, how did they react to that? And how would
Terribly,
you
terribly.
terribly, of course.
My
And
dad.
sorry, go ahead.
Well, I didn't tell them. I didn't straight up tell them I'm done with Islam. It was this like everything in my life, like even the whole doubts thing. It came incrementally. They noticed that I wasn't going to the mosque, even though I'd been always going to the mosque. I was getting less involved in the Islamic organizations, so I wasn't teaching at the madrasa anymore. I wasn't hanging out with Muslims. I was hanging out with non-Muslims constantly, but I wasn't hanging out with my Muslim friends who made up like 90% of my social circle at the time. And even other things, I guess, I wasn't so keen to go to like burdas or like what do you call them? Like these like it's these Sufi kind of songs. I don't know what you'd call it, but yeah, I wouldn't go to those anymore.
So,
So my family started questioning me,
sorry
and
to interrupt again.
eventually, yeah.
Just when you mentioned like you going to like these Sufi things, so are you from a Sufi background or Sunni or Shia or?
No, but because the one of the places where I teach that the ustad was Sufi.
Okay.
He taught us in Hanafi, but he invited us to a lot of different Sufi like practices, essentially, like yeah, to like
Okay.
praising the prophet and singing songs and things like that.
And what advice would you give to ex-Muslims who are as well known in their Muslim community, but on that same thing where you're just on that fence of whether they go become open or stay closeted? Do they tell their family? Or what is some advice that you would give to ex-Muslims in a similar position that you were or are in?
Yeah. So it's weird because having been involved in the Muslim community as an ex-Muslim, I feel like I've got a lot more achieved than I did during, like, the years and years that I was actually a Muslim and involved in the Muslim community. I've been, talking to politicians and a lot of different like media personalities. I've been involved in fairly comprehensive training courses, like media training and stuff like that. And like I said, getting involved in this podcast and host a bunch of events. And in all those opportunities, I've had the ability to push for more liberal values in those communities, and I think it's largely been successful. When you come at it from an Islamic perspective, ironically, from the perspective that I'm part of this community, you can't deny me the fact that I get an equal say as you. A lot, like I think the majority of Muslims in Australia, anyway, would have to accommodate to some degree or the other. Especially when you've known these people for years and years and years, and you've never pushed, and then suddenly you're pushing. I guess my advice would be there's the potential for a lot of change from within, and if that's something that you're passionate about, it's definitely worth it. Like even in terms of the whole ex-Muslim thing, because I've slowly sort of incrementally been coming out to people about my disbelief, and people in the leaders in the Muslim community have actually called me up after I told them that I've met with sort of ex-Muslim speakers and things like that, and hinted that maybe I could get a dialogue going on, and they're actually quite interested in having a dialogue with ex-Muslims, at least some Muslim leaders. So I think that there's been a fair bit of progress. So yeah,
That's good. It's admirable what you're doing at the moment. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, if you can
Thanks.
bridge a gap and it makes it a little bit more acceptable, it definitely make things easier for a lot of people.
Yeah, I will say it gets frustrating dealing with the more hardline people, because sometimes there's some people who will just identify exactly what you're trying to do, and they won't give up on bringing you down.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's everywhere.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
All right, well, thanks for that, Deen. And now, if Nulli, you want to tell us your story, and then I'll bore you with mine.
I've told my story many times, but I've never really spoken about the beginning, or what I think necessarily is the beginning of my story, because many people are aware that my mother converted to Islam and then I left after 20 years. So to really begin my story is you have to begin with my mother. So because if she'd not become Muslim, then I wouldn't be an ex-Muslim. So she was raised in a broken family, half of which were Jewish, the other half were Catholic. And she grew up in the 80s, and where it was cool to rebel. So she became heavily involved and associated with, your punks, your rockers, and your Hells Angels bikies. She did.
I didn't know that.
Eventually she grew out of that phase and she had me and my brother. And one night she was at a nightclub and she met a bunch of Muslim guys and started questioning her. And at this time she was a born-again Christian. And they started questioning her about her religion, and she couldn't answer those questions. And so she goes to a mosque and she asks the imam at the mosque, "Oh, can you answer these questions? Because my pastor can't answer these questions." And he answered them for her. And she became Muslim the day and put the hijab on that day. And then my life was ruined.
Were you born at that point? Was it before
I
you were born?
No,
I was about 2 years old.
Oh, okay.
When she converted. So I didn't really have a choice in the matter.
Yeah, but it's okay, so you said Catholic, Jewish, and then she converted to Islam. So she just wanted to make sure she got all three of the Abrahamic faiths covered, just in
Yeah,
case.
I like to say it's like the trifecta. Yeah, and her family says that her being Muslim is her longest phase. But yes. So within 3 months of her converting to Islam, she married my stepdad. As many people know, he's Somalian, and he's very hardline Somalian. And very quickly, it was the niqab on, hijab on at 6 for me. Transitioning forward at 13, it was the niqab. I was pulled out of school. And from quite a young age, because I had been exposed to non-Muslims, because when my mum converted, there wasn't a lot of Muslims, and a lot of the schools I went to were non-Muslim schools. And so I could never really comprehend the fact, very similar to Deen, is why is it that like a good non-Muslim is definitely going to be burning in hell for all eternity, but an imam who beats his wife or whatever he does, he's going to heaven? Like I just couldn't comprehend it from such a young age. And the whole concept of, Islam give women rights before everyone else, but my own rights were being stripped away. I was being denied an education because I had to obey my parents. Again, similar to what Deen said, is you had to obey your parents, because if you didn't obey your parents, it's like you were going to be cursed by angels, you're never going to go to heaven, and it was all that sort.
Yeah, they say your parents are like one step below the prophet, and the prophet is like one step below God, or something like that.
Yeah. And so I was having all these issues and obviously, as a 13-year-old girl, like a child, having to wear a niqab, but I couldn't run around anymore. I couldn't play with my friends because, the Muslim men would just assume that I was a woman. And so I was made to grow up very fast. It was also at the point when I was, 14, 15, where my mum was like, oh, we should look at getting you married. And, it's quite prolific in the community that, the Muslim community my family are involved in, is a lot of girls do get engaged or married between 15 or 16.
Yeah.
And I think it's quite a common thing in where we live. And I was like, oh, I don't want to get married. I'm 15. So I'd keep pushing it off. I'd keep finding excuses why I didn't like this guy or why I didn't like that guy. And it was also around the time where I was kind of where I never really felt this connection with Allah or Islam. I was kind of like, oh, it's a religion. I'll just like, like those Christians who say they're Christian, but they only go to church on Christmas. Those sort of like, I was like, but I looked the part of your perfect Muslimah. Like I looked terrifying. Most Muslims would cross the street to avoid me. No one wants to walk near a niqabi. Yeah, maybe they had to. Yeah.
Well, the men.
Yeah.
But yeah, so and I just was, when I was giving a conference recently, I said like the only reason why I wore the niqab and obeyed my parents is because I didn't want the shit beaten out of me, and I just did it to obey them, because the fear of my parents was more than my fear of Allah. And when I was 15, my youngest sister passed away, and I was the one that found her body. She was 2 years old. And I remember holding her body and obviously crying and trying to call 000 or 911. And I remember looking at her face and going, what the fuck? If there's a God, why is he killing this 2-year-old child who's done nothing, who hasn't even lived their life? Why? Why would you do that? Why would a God who's so just and so merciful and so caring and so loving and all those other 99 bloody names that he has, why would he kill a 2-year-old child? What does it prove to kill a 2-year-old child? And it was there that I stopped believing. I was just like, nah. And it was also then when I was like, I need to leave. I need to get out. But as a 15-year-old who's been taught from such a young age that, the kuffar hate you and they don't support Muslims and you can't survive by yourself. So obviously at 15, I didn't know how to escape, and I couldn't tell anyone because the community that I was in is if you had doubts about Islam, the first thing was a ruqya, an exorcism was done on you. And I've had them done. and they're terrifying. You don't want to be held down and have some imam reciting the Quran and while spitting on you or throwing water on you. Like, it's terrifying.
Oh, jeez. Oh my God. Okay, I've seen articles and stuff about it, and I've seen videos of it, but I don't know anyone that's ever had one done. That's insane.
It's in Australia, obviously they can't go too far, but when my family were living in Somalia, one of my cousins was so-called possessed, and they were holding her down, and she was screaming at them to let her go. She was like screaming because there's like 4 massive men holding this like tiny woman down. And they were just like, no, it's the devil in her. It's the jinn in her. They're trying to control her. Don't let her go. And she was fighting them with everything, screaming, let me go, let me go. And it's terrifying. And the more you fight it, the more they say that you're a jinn and you're possessed, not you're trying to escape this,
And, and in my community, we don't have like that kind of things, but there's a lot of accusations of like, your shaitan is making you think that you need to say "A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim." It's like your parents can just disagree with you on anything and just be like, shaitan is making you say that. But
it's true. And so fast forwarding to when I was 18, 19, I'd found the only way I could deal with stuff at home was to use the Quran and the hadiths and everything to try and get my parents to release some control of me. So I've studied everything. I went through Bulugh al-Maram, Sahih al-Bukhari, Riyadh al-Salihin, Tafsir ibn Kathir. I studied fiqh. I studied, like all of it. I studied Aqidah. I studied Islamic jurisprudence and creed and all the little Islamic books in between. And all I could find were justifications. I never went to, I know some people have gone to a sheikh and the sheikh's gone, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. But I was like, well, I don't even need to do that, because from what I was seeing right in front of me was justifications. Yeah, no, I didn't have a right to go against my parents' wishes. I didn't have the right to do anything, because at the end of the day, if my parents didn't want me to do it, I couldn't do it. Eventually, at 19, I said, enough's enough. And I got into a particularly brutal fight with my parents. And it was 11 o'clock at night, I remember. And it was just after Isha prayer. And my stepdad came home, and they were, I don't know, I can't remember what I'd done wrong that day. And they were just going off at me. And they were like, give us your phone, give us your laptop. We want to go through it. You must be, there's something wrong with you. You must be associating with the wrong people. And in that moment, I just became like cold. I didn't have any emotions. I didn't have any reactions. And I walked into my room and I grabbed my phone and I grabbed my purse and I ran out the door. But before I ran out of that door, I said to my parents, fuck you and fuck your God. Now, I don't recommend people leave this way, because I didn't have anywhere to go. I didn't have clothes. I didn't have money. I didn't know how to do anything. Like, I literally didn't know how to find a job. I didn't know how to open a bank account. I had absolutely no life skills whatsoever. So I don't recommend you do this. But thankfully, I knew a non-Muslim girl who was willing to have me come and stay with her. And so I pretty much cut myself off from the Muslim community when I left. I deleted all my social media, changed my phone number, and basically just wiped I didn't exist anymore. And I'm open. I choose to remain anonymous online just, because, well, some certain people are insane and I don't want to die.
Yeah, big time.
But I wanted to just recover, because you have to go through recovery when you leave an environment like that. So I didn't even look for people who were like me. I didn't look for ex-Muslims. I didn't look for Muslims. If your name was Muhammad, I avoided you like the plague.
Just to interrupt for a second, if you don't mind. The way you mentioned it there, like you had to delete all your social media, everything. It's like the cost of that. Like, you have to completely wipe out your life. And I've been using this example a little bit because it's just other stuff that's going on. But it's like in 1984 when you become an unperson. Like every record of you is expunged from the system. you are no longer a person. You don't exist. Your history's all deleted. It's
Yeah, no,
um,
it is like my case. It was a bit more extreme because, well, my family are very, very hardline. I guess you would call them Salafis or Wahhabis or, whatever you would call them. So I had to, like, I lived in an area where there was no Muslims. Anytime I would see somebody I knew, I would literally run. I would run out of that shopping center because I needed to maintain my safety. So that safety meant that nobody could know where I was. No one.
Mm.
Like, at the time, for about the first, I don't know, 2 years after I left home, only 3 people knew where I lived. Obviously, work and college and uni on that knew where I was, but 3 people knew where I lived, and they were my partner and a friend, and then one of his friends. That's it. That's where people knew where I lived, and it's an isolating experience because you've lost complete contact with everybody, and I later found out that my parents lied to the community because of their social standing, having a daughter who is the pillar of piety leave. They had to lie. They didn't want to say that their daughter had run off and she wasn't a Muslim anymore. So they said that I'd moved overseas to study. And when I didn't come back a few years later, they were like, "Oh, she met a boy and she got married and she's living overseas and she's got kids." And
Wow.
because it's very, very
yeah.
it's very unheard of for, like in the community for a girl to just leave. Like it's not a thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I've been open now for since 2011. I left 1 week before my birthday. So that's what, 6 years now. And advice I would give to anyone who is, in a similar situation as to me is your life is what matters the most. If you can stay at home and survive, like while you are saving up money or trying to plan, I would recommend you stay home. But if at any point your life is threatened, just leave. Just go, because these situations can escalate, especially if your parents fight, especially as a female as well, is Muslim girls carry the honor of their family. It's not Muslim boys. Muslim boys can go and have sex with whoever they want. They can drink, they can smoke, they can do whatever they want. But Muslim girls are the ones that carry the family honor. And so when that honor is seen to be destroyed or tarnished, things can happen very badly to girls. I've known girls who've been forced into marriages simply for talking to a man at a train station. My own mother dragged me out of a library because I showed a man how to use something on a computer. Physically dragged me out, screaming at me, calling me a whore. And if you're in an environment where your safety is threatened, get the fuck out. Go to a police station, find a refuge. These places exist. Unless you're in a Muslim country, then I'm sorry, I don't have any advice for you. But if you do live in a Western country, that is what my advice would be. Thank you. Sorry.
Well, no worries.
Now tell us your boring story.
Well, okay. I mean, it's going to be a little bit anticlimactic after you two because it wasn't nearly that stressful. Okay, I was born in India, and my family was Sunni, or is Sunni, I should say. And we moved to Canada when I was 6, so that was the end of '75. And my parents were fairly open. My family in general is fairly open and moderate. Like my dad, when we moved here specifically, moved us to a neighborhood that was not ghettoized. Like in the mid '70s, at that point, there had been some small ghettoization of South Asian communities, but not very much. It's a lot more ghettoized now, especially in places like Toronto and Vancouver. But so his idea was, okay, we've left India, we've come to Canada. I want my family to integrate. I want my kids to integrate. I want my kids to become part of the society. So I'm not leaving India to go live in a little India in Canada. So like I said, I think like, things like that. My parents were more open. They wanted us to be part of the society, so it wasn't like you can't have non-Muslim friends. And also because of where they moved us, I mean, there wasn't a lot of Muslim kids around anyway. So unless you want your kids to just live in the house, they go out and play, they're going to make friends, right? And with me, like what started happening was around the age of 11. My dad always loved nature documentaries and science documentaries. And so in 1980, when the Cosmos series came out, the Carl Sagan one, when it first aired, we sat down and we watched it. And I've always been an extremely curious kid. Like, I question anything anyone ever said. So if my parents told me that the sun rises in the east, I would wake up in the morning to go check. Like I remember when like my dad was telling a story about he used to go hunting in India when he was before we moved to Canada, and he was telling a story about to me and my brother just entertain us type of thing, and it's like, oh yeah, we're driving around and everywhere there was like rocks about this big, and he like roughly shows them. And then he's like, oh, the road was very bumpy. But like my first thing was like, okay, no, Dad, I'm calling bullshit on that, because if all the rocks were all the same size, then it wouldn't be that bumpy. And he's just looking at me like, come on, kid, I'm telling you a story. Just shut up and listen. Don't ask questions. So, so like I said, I questioned everything. And then Carl Sagan, his way of talking about the scientific method, his way of talking about, you look at things and you look for the evidence and you go where the evidence leads you. If the evidence leads you somewhere you don't like, that you can't really do much about it because it's pointing in that direction. If you find something that, okay, if you found some evidence first and then you find something new comes to light that scraps everything else, then you have to be open to get rid of everything you thought in the past based on new evidence that's shown up. And that was when I started. That was just, it came out just before seventh grade started. So then when seventh grade started, we were sitting in class, and the more and more stuff I learned in class, but this is basically just science classes. So learning that the sun's going to go nova in 5 billion years, and then comparing that with the Day of Judgment. Both can't be true. Only one can. So the sun sets in a puddle of mud every night. You know, uh, when it describes the firmament and how it's almost like the flat Earth with a dome over the Earth and stuff like that. Like it's just none of that made any sense to me. So,
or evolution.
Yeah, evolution. I mean, just there's one thing after another, and it's like, okay, if this is the perfect word, unalterable, unfailing, no errors, and it's got these basic things wrong, what else is wrong? And up until that point, like I said, my family's from India. By origin, my family's Arab, but even my parents were born in India. No one spoke Arabic. So, I'm going by what was told to me by my parents, by my grandparents, aunts, uncles, all this, right? So, and it didn't make sense. So, I just couldn't believe it anymore. And then for about 6 years, I just kind of put up a pretense, and then that was it. And I just couldn't take it anymore, and I let my family know, and that was the end of it. And I mean, it wasn't like just, okay, I told them and everything was fine. Like, obviously there was a couple of days of discussions and yelling and screaming and back and forth, but finally it was accepted, and I've never had much of an issue with it. Now, I did go back in my mid-20s and reread everything in English, and that was the first time I'd read any of the stuff in English so I could understand it. And so you've also got to understand, like, this was in the so my mid-20s. I was it was like 91, 92. So the internet had just started, right? So there wasn't, or the internet for the public, so there wasn't Google. There wasn't, like I think people were still using like Yahoo search at that point. And so there wasn't anything like that. So you couldn't find all that information. So it was just, reading translations, reading what you could find and looking into it. And the reason I did that was I said, okay, well, I believe in this method of, like the scientific method and believing in evidence, but I've never once looked at this stuff in a language I could understand. And once I did, I was like, okay, I made the right choice because this is just insane. And I mean, that was, for me, the whole transition was fairly easy. It was afterwards, there was some acrimony from some family, but they were distant and I didn't care. Like they lived either in India or some in the Middle East or in Europe, and I'm like, okay, I'm in Canada, you guys are far away, so I have never. And some of these were people I'd never seen before, and I'm getting something from them. So like I just didn't really care about it. Like I said, from my end, it was a science that got me, and then after I looked into it, I knew I made the right decision. By the time I read it in English, I was doing poli-sci in university, and I'd read the Bible quite a bit, just because there were reasons why things were done, like why the Catholic Church divided up South America between Portugal and Spain and stuff. So like there were decisions that were made politically that were done through the Bible, so that's why I was reading it. And and then the similarities between some of the stories, the stuff is just as insane. And Muhammad flying to the moon on a donkey on a winged donkey with the face of a man and a peacock tail, but he had to go from Mecca to Jerusalem, then from Jerusalem to the moon, because apparently there's no direct flying donkeys from Mecca to the moon, and you have to catch a connection in Jerusalem. I don't know. So yeah, I mean, there's stuff like that, and so that's what it was for me. And then, like I said, the more you read it, the more you look into it, and then you look into things like what your right hand owns, basically meaning your slaves. A word is worth half that of a man. The trees are going to cry out, like on Judgment Day or whatever, when Jesus comes back and kills everyone except for all the Muslims. The trees are going to tell you that there's a Jew hiding behind them. The rocks are going to tell you that. Like,
Oh my god, yeah.
yeah. So
I heard that
it
at
just
work
like,
recently.
yeah.
I was just
You know,
terrified. It's horrible.
So once one of it falls apart, and you can unravel that thread, like the whole tapestry just comes undone. Yeah, so that's basically my story in a nutshell. Like I said, it's a little bit anticlimactic after YouTube.
No. I think it was interesting how you mentioned that you hadn't read it in English, but you'd read, like, I'm curious, what language did you sort of?
Okay, I read it in Arabic. My parents taught me to read it in Arabic, but
Okay.
didn't understand a word of what I was reading. Right, like I grew up speaking
Yeah.
Urdu, and that's my mother tongue is Urdu, and I spoke that, and so my understanding of it was from what my parents told me, what my grandparents, my grandmother actually, and then a friend of my mom's who was teaching us how to read the Quran as well, and then they taught us how to do the prayers, and they taught us all the stories and things like that. But it was, I think the difference from my end and from you guys as well is my parents grew up in. My dad grew up in India. My mom grew up in Pakistan. Her family moved to Pakistan after partition. You didn't have the oil money, the petrodollars flowing in when they were growing up. So even though it was hard line to some extent, it was a lot more moderated, and it was a lot more. It was a more relaxed version, and I think that made a huge difference as opposed to if they, let's say they'd grown up in the 80s, right, when you had a lot of Saudi money coming in, and you had more and more fundamentalism coming in, and they might have grown up with a more fundamental version. I don't know. but yeah, I think so. Like, I think that made a huge difference for us. And I mean, this is something I talked about before with a few other people. Was I think it's also the education system. Um, India is still a very British style system, but they've put more of a local flavor, which is fine. Pakistan, I believe it was in '72, they said, okay, no more British back system. It's going to be an Islamic education system. So you, in India, you might, like nowadays, you might read more local authors and poetry and stuff, especially in places where they speak Urdu. They'll do a lot of Urdu poetry, but you would have still read some of the British classics. So you might have read, Austen and Dickens and Shakespeare, or you might have read any of that stuff. That if you go to another Commonwealth country, you have some commonality with the people there because you've read and you studied some of the same literature, so that makes things easier for you to assimilate. Whereas if you're just going to a madrasa, or you're going, like I said, in Pakistan, it's an Islamic-based school system, you don't share anything really in common, so it's harder to integrate.
Going back to your point about the the generations, like, so how you said your parents were from like an older generation, and more kind of, I wouldn't say like more moderate, not as serious, crazy about the religion. I definitely would think that's true because personally I've noticed here, and Dean probably also has noticed it, is the grandparent generation of those that came to Australia tend to be a lot more liberal minded than, say, our parents or our generation, which tend to be a lot more hardline with it. And I think it also comes with them maybe having this need to prove their Islam to people, to prove how religious they are.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
I don't
well,
know. I don't know. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, I think there was sort of a resurgence in the '90s of this Islam as an identity, and
Yeah.
and then after 9/11, there was sort of like an even stronger wave of that uh that was popularized around the world.
Yeah, but I mean, I think it's also, I mean, there's the identity thing and wanting to hold back to it. I think there's two parts of it, and it's if you look at like colonial powers, right? Um, and I'm gonna use Islam as a colonial force here for a second. So if you look at like colonial powers, so when the Brits or the French or the Spanish or whatever, whenever they went somewhere, the colonists who came off the boats first, they hung on to the traditions of their homelands, right? And then when the next wave of colonists came in, those traditions might have evolved in England, but not evolved in the colony because they were sticking on to what, like you said, they want to prove, like they're proving they're British, right? They're proving they're English. And when the new colonists come in, they can maybe then update it. But I think if you look at after the '80s, when they started putting all the petrodollars out and they started spreading, like this, started building madrasas and building mosques and spreading that, the Wahhabist version of Islam, that was kind of like a colonization in a way. And it's so the people, so you're getting the older colonists. Let's just like some people are going to get pissed off that I'm using that term, but like let's just say like the older immigrants who come in, you're kind of converting to them, but they're still sticking on to what they remember. And then you get the newer generation, and you're teaching them from young kids. So you're getting that, and it's like, okay, well, these are your traditions from these are your traditions from Saudi Arabia. This is where Islam started. These are the Islamic traditions. This is what you have to hold on to. And I think that's made a bigger difference in the generational shift than um, than just the kids saying, okay, we want to reclaim our identities. I think it was pushed through these madrasas and these mosques, and I think it was done like that. Like I don't think it was done exactly. Like I said, I don't think it. I'm not saying there wasn't anything of identity in there. I think it was just more done of, like with the old colonists, these people are wanting to hold on to their traditions and, like you said, prove that they are just as devout, if not more so, than the people from the old country, if you want to say it that way. Sorry,
Yeah,
rambled for a
definitely.
bit there.
Yeah, it's okay. No, it's definitely
Yeah.
interesting. Definitely. But yeah, so I think maybe from the perspective of like maybe Australia, personally that's what I've noticed is because we do have schools here who are both Saudi funded and not Saudi funded. We have schools that are funded by different Muslim countries and
Yeah, so a lot of people here really despise the whole Wahhabi movement. Really, um, even a lot
Yeah,
of the extreme, like the
what's
more
the word?
fundamentalists. Yeah,
yeah, but it's like that's just it. Like, not all fundamentalists are Wahhabis, right? Like,
Yeah.
because in like Wahhabism was what 1700s when it was when whatever Abdul Wahhab and the Saud family kind of made that you know like the
I
deal
honestly am not
done up in
sure.
hell. You know, it
Like,
was in
who
the
founded it.
1700s.
Yeah.
Anyways, I mean that's pretty much it. Like I don't, as far as advice and stuff goes, I would kind of echo what Nulli had said. It's your, I think in the West, and this goes, and I know I don't want to speak for things beyond my experience, but I think this would go for a lot of the other, like, so if you're like Orthodox Jewish or if you're Jehovah's Witness or Mormon, you're going to face some of the similar things. But I think in the West, um, it would be a little bit easier. I realize for Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons, they are technically Western faiths, but there is so much available to you. But you have to judge for yourself. You cannot, don't put yourself at risk. And if you are at risk, get the hell out of there. But if you can, if you're okay, I'm finishing college, I'm finishing university, I need some help, I'd do that. I'd wait, I'd wait, get that done, and then come out on your own terms. Come out when you're ready. Come out when you are able to, and don't put yourself at risk. But if you can't take it anymore, then live your life as you wish.
Yeah, because there's a
Anyway,
huge
so
cost associated with coming out, and you
yeah,
can't predict what's going to happen either. Maybe they'll be fine with it. Maybe they'll disown you and tell everyone you know. Like, you don't know.
yeah. Well, that's pretty much it. Um,
Yep.
so I mean, that's who we are right now, and like as we said before, we're trying to do this podcast to help people from all faiths who have left, and they have to deal with issues of being shunned, violence, completely cut off from your support system, completely cut off from your family, having to wipe everything out about yourselves. Um, we've got a few people lined up to speak with, and on our next episode, we're actually really excited to have Yasmin Muhammad and Jimmy London from Free Hearts, Free Minds, which is an organization that Yasmin had started to help ex-Muslims in Muslim-majority countries get counseling. And Jimmy's actually the person giving the counseling to the ex-Muslims, so we'll have them on next week. And we also have a few other people lined up. Jen Sutton, who is an ex-Muslim and an ex-Mormon. Gada Ledoux, who has done a couple of talks for ex-Muslims in North America. She's a Saudi ex-Muslim. And yeah, so we're gonna have these things coming up. If you'd like to talk to us about what you've gone through, you can do so anonymously. Please contact us. You can reach out to us on Twitter at Heretics Corner, or email us at hereticscorner@gmail.com. We'd love to have you on. We'd love to talk to you. If you have any advice or if you have questions about things that you think we might be able to help you through, just give us a shout and we'll love to get you on.
Yeah, sounds awesome. Really enjoyed the talk, guys.
But yeah, so thanks for listening, everyone, and don't forget to subscribe, share this with everybody you know, because we do want to be that voice, despite the fact that all three of us are ex-Muslims. we understand that there's a need for apostates to speak up, which is why we've started the hashtag Apostates Speak Up. So if you are wanting to share your story, or if you just want to, you're on Twitter and you want to create a thread, use that hashtag. We'll check it all the time. We'll retweet your stories. We also have a WordPress where if you're not comfortable coming on and speaking about your story or your journey, you can send us, via an email or reach out to any of us on Twitter. We'll have all of our Twitter handles down below. And we can publish your story on the blog just so that your voice is being heard. We want to be a group that is for apostates. We want to be a podcast for apostates. It's not just ex-Muslims. It's not just, ex-Jehovah's Witness, ex-Jew, ex-Christian, or whatever flavor of religion you were previously. So I think we can all unite on that fact that we are all apostates from differing religions. It doesn't matter how easy, in quotation marks, your journey's been, or how hard it's been. Everyone's story and journey is uniquely their own, and we want to hear them. They need to be heard. And just before we head off, I'd like to say to everybody, happy belated Atheist Day. I think they're making, was it the 24th or the 23rd of March is now going to be the inaugural Atheist Day, I believe?
Yeah, it's actually 23rd of March 2019. If you actually go to, I believe it's atheistday.org. Maybe we can put the link in when the video is out. So what they want you to do is, if you can, go out openly march, and they made a green circle as your symbol, and so if you can carry that, or if you can't, they're just asking you to wear like a green bracelet or a green necklace, so you can show your support but not put yourself at any risk.
Okay, that's cool. Unfortunately for us in Australia, it's actually the 25th already, so we missed it. Sorry.
Yeah, well, it's, you guys have to be that far ahead to like keep away from all the poisonous animals trying to kill you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I hope, like I said, we hope everybody really enjoyed our first ever episode. Do apologize for any technical glitches and or errors. We're really excited to see this go and expand further into the future. So yeah, don't forget to leave a comment down below. Any questions? We're super excited. Are we not?
Yeah, super excited.
Oh, it's going to be great. Hopefully
It'll be
it takes off, and I'd love to hear what anyone out there thinks.
So wherever you are in the world, we hope you have a lovely morning, day, night, evening, and we'll talk soon. See you guys.
See ya.
See ya.